Hello and welcome to the MABE podcast. I am your host, Andrew Rogers, the president of MABE. This is our second episode, the first episode, proper episode, I might say, with an education consultant. Today's guest is Elise White Diaz. She will be talking about the intersection of trauma and language development in culturally and linguistically diverse students. So Elise taught in Tegucigalpa, Honduras for a time, and then taught in North Texas. And she has a book that's being published next month called Discover, Connect, Respond, a practical approach to trauma-informed instruction. So welcome, Elise.
Thank you, Andrew. It's so great to see you again.
Thanks. So for starters, before we get into the meaty stuff, why don't you tell us a little bit about your time teaching in Honduras?
Yeah, sure. It was an amazing experience, and I go back there as often as I can. I like to tell teachers about how I got into education because it's kind of in an unusual way. I was in nonprofit work, and I was working with a community that had formed around a garbage dump in the capital city of Honduras. And all throughout the developing world, this is a very familiar situation because when people can't find work, they'll move to the big cities and they'll hear about work in the garbage dump where they can sort through garbage and find things to resell and in hopes of making a living wage. But the challenge is that it takes entire family units working together to make that living wage as best they can, which means children are working alongside grandparents. And as you can imagine, there are many different forms of trauma in these garbage dump communities, which sometimes police are not allowed to enter in because they're ruled by gangs. And there's so many hard things that kids experience. So this was the community that we were working with. And at the time, my job was to develop a sponsorship program and fundraising and infrastructure and things like that. And they said, "Hey, Elise, we need some more teachers in the classroom." And I said, "That sounds amazing, but this is kind of intimidating because these kids come from a really hard place." The average education in that community was third grade. And so I did it anyway, and I discovered a couple things. I discovered that the children were amazing and resilient, and that I love teaching. And so the kids somehow in this environment got a vision for education and went on to college. And I just fell in love with teaching even more so at that point. And so when we moved back to the United States, I said, "Get me into a classroom and get me there quickly." And I ended up serving in an under-resourced middle school where the majority of students were from Central America. So that's kind of my origin story when it comes to public education.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, and again, like teaching, sometimes people just get stressed. I get it, I get stressed. But you sometimes forget, like teaching, it's such a gift, and to be able to give to these students, especially the ones that need it and don't always get the attention that they should be getting, is just really it's very rewarding as a teacher, as an instructor. So your topic, again, we're talking about trauma-informed instruction. So why is this important? Why is this topic important for educators and students right now?
Oh, that's a great question, Andrew. And I feel like it's so important right now. Probably, I don't know if I could say more important than it ever has been. But with just some of the challenges that people are experiencing, challenges when they come to the country. I like to use the word hard place instead of trauma, because especially with our multilingual students, we don't know oftentimes if they do come from a trauma affected background. But sometimes we know that they've come from a hard place, like the garbage dump. They've come from a hard journey to get to the United States. They've had some hardships maybe in their immigrant community. And just thinking about the pandemic, even that happened recently, that if in the United States, we dealt with it, right? In other countries, they might have had a completely different experience with the pandemic where they would tell children, I know at least in Honduras, they would say, "Hey, we want you to go to school on your device with your Wi-Fi during these 2 years, but what about those who don't have Wi-Fi or devices to use? What about those who are struggling just to survive in poverty? And so I would say in the last couple of years, challenges have become compounded even more for some of our students. And they continue to be very anxious about the future right now. And so I think it behooves all of us to really consider the impact of trauma on some of our multilingual students.
Yes, certainly. And I've read a lot about the way the pandemic played out in different countries, especially in developing countries. And obviously, we struggled here, but we're in a country that has a lot of resources, and getting students the access to learn remotely wasn't the challenge that it was in areas such as where you were in Honduras. Um, so, to that effect, talking about language proficiency and multilingual learners. So, how does language proficiency play into? Sorry, you just gave the other term, but I'll say it again. How does language proficiency play into this trauma informed outline?
Yeah, that's a great question. Talking about how language proficiency kind of intersects with trauma. And as we're serving our multilingual students, I think that it will be the common experience of many teachers to have a student under their care, and we can identify how long they've been in the country. We can make some expectations about their language development. And many of us have found that for some reason, one or two of our students, a couple of our students are behind in their language development, and we don't know why, right? We wonder, is there something else going on? Is there some sort of learning disability? And so if we can discover kind of the student story a little bit and what's behind where they came from, discover if they did in fact come from a hard place, then we're going to approach maybe that delay, those lagging skills, the delay in language development in a different way, in a trauma-informed way than we would ordinarily.
So, could you talk about that a little bit more as far as it related to your work in North Texas? So, let's think about multilingual learners in the United States. How did you see that play out in your work setting in Texas?
Yeah, well, there's so many different situations, right, in North Texas. And ironically, when I was working there for different districts, it wouldn't matter if it was a district in a community that had a lot of lack of resources and was struggling in poverty. It wouldn't matter if it was a high achieving school where people would move to the area just for that school, right, and came from a lot of opportunity. Whatever socioeconomic place the school was in, trauma was there. So it seems to not matter, just in my experience and my observation, my research about socioeconomic development, trauma finds a way. A couple different ways it would play out depending on different student scenarios. So many times we would have experienced multilinguals, also known by some people as long-term English learners, and they were not making the expected progress in language development. We're trying to figure out why, right? We're taking them through the MTSS process. We're trying to see, is there a learning disability involved? And so many of the times, and that in my experience at least, many of our students who were behind and lagging in their language development would come from a hard place. And so then as we apply some trauma-informed practices, one of my favorite ones is the 4S routine for emotional attunement. And what we're really doing with this routine is we are recreating something that's called the attachment cycle from attachment theory. And I'll go a little bit more into that later if you'd like. In order to help students to feel seen, soothed, safe, and secure, and move kind of from their downstairs brain, as Dr. Dan Siegel calls it, into their upstairs brain, where language and logic and memory happen and language production happen. So when we are able to help our students do that, their language develops so much more quickly. And so sometimes it looked like, experienced multilinguals who we would discover came from a hard place. And so now we're going to connect with them in a different way, and we're going to respond to them in a different way. Sometimes it was newcomers who came in from a different set of hard places, right? Newcomers, I remember one in particular who was just terrified to be in school after something that happened in his home country. And so being able to give educators the resources to know how to connect and co-regulate is a term we use in trauma-informed education, meaning that I am going to lend the calm of my nervous system to you. When we're able to do this with students, it really helps them to feel that sense of belonging and safety and produce language and produce amazing academic outcomes.
Yeah, so a couple of things that come to mind as I'm hearing you talk. One is just the disparate needs of ELLs. And, often they're placed in the same category. And sometimes you get teachers' manuals, they say for your English language learners. And I always want to say, but which ones? The levels ones, the level 2, level 3, level 4, and then newcomers, there's students that have limited or interrupted formal education, and there's students who come and they're at grade level, they're ready to go. They just need a little bit of help. And then also too, within a group, a student who's newer, but really knows the language of school, knows how to discern what tasks you're asking them to do, respond readily to gestures and graphic organizers and those kinds of visuals. And you have other students who, their English is better per se, their social English, perhaps too, their academic, but it's just taking longer. And just, being able to look at those groups and understanding what the needs are of those groups. But more specifically to what you were saying, from our discussions before, our emails before, I just came across this quote from Stephen Krashen about the affective filter. So you're talking a lot about the affective filter, and he describes it as an imaginary wall. So again, getting in the way of the learning, and how can we, our students come to us, it's a process. They're probably not going to feel comfortable day 1, day 2, day 3 completely, but what can we do to minimize that and build their trust, make them feel safe and secure, and know that we're supporting them. And this is also,
Oh yeah, I love that you brought up Stephen Krashen's theory of the affective filter, because so many of us in working with students who are learning English as a second language, we are good at helping them to kind of dismantle that affective filter, right, and feel safe and feel comfortable. With trauma, it's a little bit different, I feel like, than just the affective filter too, because psychologists, one of the ways they define trauma is how it changes our nervous system. And so when we've had a hard thing happen to us and we've responded to it, and what really makes a difference of whether or not we've had the hard thing happen to us alone, or whether we had a caring adult who was supporting us and helping us process it. So I don't know if you've read the book, The Body Keeps the Score, but it talks about how this kind of gets lodged in our nervous system, and we stay in a state of hypervigilance, and it affects how we regulate our emotions and how we interact with others. And so I think this is something that's really important for us to know in this field, that while we're awesome at helping kids dismantle that affective filter, that sometimes there are certain students, like you're talking about before with the disparity of, there's so many different kinds of multilingual learners. There's some students who need even more support. So I'm glad that you brought that up.
Yeah, and I do feel compelled also. So a school I taught at just before the pandemic for a couple of years, elementary, but traditionally, majority ELL school. Most of the students came from Mexico, but then we got some from Honduras, and it was just, I would always try to impart upon the teachers, and there's no hard and fast rule. None of this was true 100% of the time, but definitely more so. The students who came from Mexico more often had a family unit in place. They had cousins. They had a church, and I say that for the sake of community, they had a definite place there. Most of the time, I did not get a sense of something traumatic having occurred in their journey to the United States. They felt sad about leaving their home country, but it wasn't the same. And I just be able to discern when you get a new student and be able to assess their needs, whereas the students from mostly Honduras, but the ones from Central America in general, they did not have extended family here. They usually arrived for the first time in that area. Often they did not have both parents there with them, and it just seemed like there was a story to tell there, and it was not my place to ask them if they wanted to share. I was open to it, but I was not going to pry.
Yeah.
That's not my business. If they don't, if they want to share it with me, great, I'm there for them. So just being able to look at those things. And then a couple years ago, I saw a presentation, and I was like, oh, that makes sense. It was about the average income in Mexico. They said at this presentation was $5,000 a year per family, and in Central America it was $1,500 per family. And I said, oh, that makes sense to me. Like, Mexico is definitely not where the U.S. is, but it's, in terms of development, in terms of a strong middle class, it's a lot closer to where we are in the United States, as opposed to most of the Central American countries. So just things to keep in mind as you get different students. And also too, that the way they spoke Spanish was a little bit different than the way the students from Mexico did. And then the teachers, I would ask, and I had to explain oftentimes, like, they didn't understand why this student felt isolated in this class where most of the students spoke Spanish. And I said, well, there's a little bit more to it than that. But those are just some observations I made during that
Yeah.
time.
Yeah, I agree 100% that if a student comes with a really strong community and family unit, that helps. Those are supportive factors, right? And then also the supportive factors and the unique situation when different cultures mingle, and when students can feel a sense of felt belonging in our classroom cultures. If there's different languages, different cultures being spoken, it's so fascinating, the research that's being done right now with brain scans and brain imaging. And one of the things that they've isolated is that a felt sense of lack of belonging is experienced in the brain, in the same center of the brain that we experience physical pain. And so it's so important to help our students to feel like we are welcoming them with gladness, and everybody else in the school and classroom is welcoming them as well. And we in this profession, I think we do a really good job of that. And so it's so exciting to talk with other educators about these issues.
Well, Lisa, this has been a great conversation. Did you have any final thoughts on this topic before we sign off?
Yeah, I would just like to mention that the whole way that this Discover, Connect, Respond routine is designed is to kind of bring together everything that we're talking about so that we can discover if a student did come from a hard place. We don't want them to share their trauma stories with us. We are not counselors, we are teachers, right? But we do want to know kind of what's behind the behaviors that we're seeing. Then having that opportunity to connect with our students. And sometimes when our multilingual students come from a hard place, they're especially difficult to connect with. So we have routines and systems to do that. And then what we're going to do is we're going to respond to their felt needs after we've discovered them and after we've built that relationship of trust. So all this to say is this Discover, Connect, Respond routine is designed to bring together all these elements that we mentioned on this podcast today. So thank you for bringing those up, Andrew.
Thank you so much for joining us. And again, as I told you the one time we talked at the MABE conference. What I love about what you're discussing, and what I'm sure what is in your book, because it's the title, so I'm sure it's there. But again, you're not just. I hear a lot of people talk about these topics, but they don't really give you what the actionable part of it should be and the frameworks. And it's like, okay, it's good to know about all this, but again, what do I do? That's another level to it. And you're really providing a lot of things to think about and things to do that are very concrete. So thank you so much for that.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope that we can get some tools in the hands of educators and just continue serving our multilingual students well and helping them to develop their language.
Excellent. So again, the book is Discover, Connect, Respond.
Mhm.
I know you can get it on the Sidelets website. SCIDLITZ.com. Is it on Amazon or is it anywhere else?
It will be on Amazon, I believe, at the time of our conference.
Well, hey, and guess what, too? We have the privilege to have you keynoting at our MABE conference this year and doing a breakout session. And so we're so excited to have you for that. And then again, you'll be at the Newcomer Summit, which is on July 31st in East Lansing, and that is not sold out as opposed to the MABE conference. So I hope to see a lot of people there who are listening today. And again, that's a very special conference just because it is during the summer. And anybody who's hesitant about that, I just think I love going to things free of mind. Because sometimes too, you're in the middle of teaching or you're toward and winding up the year, and yes, it's completely stressful. But this is not going to be stressful. I swear, you're going to love it. So we're excited to have you and a couple of your colleagues there as well.
Yeah, I'm excited about it too. It's going to be a great conference.
Great. All right. Thanks, everybody, and we'll see you next time.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.